Welcome to part 4 of the overview of the history of the Wye Valley Railway. My name is Kev Daniels. I'm a volunteer for the Wye Valley Greenway, which reopened part of the Wye Valley Railway as a walking and cycling route between Chepstow and Tintern in 2021. A full introduction is available at the video titled History of the Wye Valley Railway Introduction. Our opening slide shows Tidenham Tunnel, which is described in part 2. On the first slide, we see on the left a third-class coach of the type that could well have run on the Wye Valley Railway when it was an independent railway before being absorbed into the Great Western Railway. This particular coach is at Didcot Railway Centre. It has no through corridor, and so there are no toilets, has no armrests. But even with horsehair padding, one of our volunteers described it as very comfortable. Originally, there were 3 classes of travel, but the Great Western Railway abolished second class in 1910 as there was so little difference to third class. And if you look at this location here, you can see the cover of a gas mantle, and it was the last and gas lighting was a feature of almost all coaches at that time and continued for many years. The last gaslit coach was withdrawn in 1959. Now, it was not only navvies who built the railway who risked accidents. The risk continued after the line was built. This slide shows an overturned engine from February 1880. Fortunately, the engine driver escaped very serious injury. But this is not the main point of this slide. The main point are the sleepers, which we can see here. There would have been thousands of them, and they were made by a timber merchant in Hereford. The River Wye was made navigable up to Hereford by the 1695 Act for the Navigation of the River Wye, under which weirs as far as Hereford were removed. However, only smaller boats could use the upper reaches. And in this next slide, we can see boats being man-hauled south of Hereford by Doward Rocks. And the boats were hauled by groups of men, as you can see here. The river, therefore, would have provided an effective transport route to the railway. This illustrates the large and complex supply chain feeding the construction of the line: sleepers, rails, ballast, tipper wagons, provisions for the hundreds of navvies, etc. Contrast this with the performance of the British generals in the Crimean War. Pedantic supply officers left 150 tons of vegetables to rot on the quayside as they had arrived without the right paperwork. 2,500 rugs arrived, but only 800 were issued, despite the extreme cold, and shoddy boots of the wrong sizes were delivered. So we could see that the professional organisation of the railway builders was not common practice in Victorian times, far from it. In the next slide, we could see on the left a pannier tank engine, as they were called, steam engine, of the type that was in operation when the line closed to passengers in 1959. This photograph was taken between 1957 and 1958, and it was taken near Netherhope, which is in the background there, Netherhope Halt. And this class was built by the Great Western Railway at Swindon for branch line passenger works, and 75 were produced for this particular class of 1400 class engine between 1932 and 1936, 4 being preserved. Now, the coach behind the engine is no ordinary coach. of the type you would see today. It's known as an auto coach that can drive the train from the far end. This avoids turning the locomotive at the end of the line. And in the picture on the right, you can see the interior of the cab where the driver would retire to and drive the train from the opposite end to the engine. The fireman stayed in the engine to keep the fire alight to maintain steam in the boiler. And therefore, they, as you can see, the driver in this situation had an excellent view of the line ahead. Now, this auto coach design proved long-lived, and 163 examples were built to a similar design. We're now going to talk about stations. On the left is Tidenham Station, just before closure. And we have some memories from here. One comes from Olive Jeans, and she said that we always caught the diesel to Monmouth, and we caught it many times from there and to Caldicott in the late 50s. And Tidenham Station, sadly, was in a very poor state, but it was previously always kept beautifully by the station master. And she had great memories because her husband proposed to me there too. And we used to pick wild strawberries on the bank going towards Netherhope. But I'm pleased to say Keith and Jan Bryant, who are volunteers on the railway, are reintroducing to the line wildflowers that were present 100 years ago. And they can confirm that wild strawberries can still be found. Now, on the right here, we see a picture of Huey Balfour Young, station master for Tidenham, with his wife and family outside Church Cottage, Tidenham, where they lived. This photograph will be around 1900, and Hugh's career illustrates the stability of employment brought by the railways. He started on the railway aged 24 as a policeman, then became a signalman and then a booking clerk porter, and finally in 1890, aged 45, he became the station master, until he finally retired 19 years later with a GWR pension. And there is a saying on the railways, once a railway worker, always a railway worker. The railway brought long-term employment and a career with a pension, unusual in Victorian times. Hugh described himself as a station master in 2 census returns, and he was known as this in Tidenham, but he never was a station master. The railway records recorded his employment as a second-class station inspector. Smaller stations employed station inspectors and were grouped under larger stations, the title station master being reserved for these larger stations. The status of station masters can be judged from the gift of a silver tea and coffee service in February 1878 to Mr. Florence John Tidenham at Tintern Station on the occasion of his marriage, and it was subscribed by 120 persons. Florence Tidenham was the first station master at Tidenham, and his job title is confirmed by the railway records. So we know that Hugh Young reported to the Tintern station master. I think that Hugh Young's adoption of the title station master has to be seen in the context of the contribution of the railway made to changing the rigid Victorian social structure. Station masters were very well respected, and they reported to a management outside the previous social hierarchy. In a sense, they were classless. It no doubt suited both Hugh and the people of Tidenham that he was known as a station master. We're now going to look at Tintern Station, and on the left you can see a rather grand station master in his frock coat here, and a couple in this location dressed in Edwardian clothing, formal Edwardian summer clothing until it was summer, by the boat that he's wearing. But the main point of this slide is neither the station master or the two passengers. It is the milk churns. One of the impacts of the railway was that local farmers could obtain a bigger price for their milk. So they could send fresh milk, still warm when it arrived, to Bristol, for example, and command a higher price. As a result of that, local people were paying more for their milk. So this is an example where, in fact, the benefits of the railways were not evenly spread. And we're now going to move on to Netherhope Halt. There were 6 halts built by the Great Western Railway between 1927 and 1932 in an attempt to increase traffic. Netherhope was built in 1932 and was the last one. It's got an ash and cinder platform, plenty of ash and cinders available from the locomotives of the day. We have a reminiscence from Celia Hinton. She said she used to take the train every day to Monmouth School for girls from Netherhope Halt. She says, one day a boy from Monmouth School for boys was larking about and snatched a girl's berry, throwing it out of the train window into a bramble patch by the quarry. The guard told the driver, who backed up the line and stopped the train. The guard hopped out and retrieved the berry, and then off we went through the woods with a glistening Y on our left-hand side past the Abbey. We're now going to look at quarry traffic. Quarry traffic was very important because it extended the life of the railway, at least as far as the quarries were concerned, for more than 30 years. On the left, we see what's called a ballast train. Ballast is the material, which you can see here, that goes under the tracks and it maintains the comfortable riding surface for vehicles riding across it. It has to be regularly renewed. Here we have a train passing the site of Tidenham station on the way to Tintern quarry. At Tidenham, we can see ballast heaped on the platform, and that needed tractor units and shovels to load the wagons. Although later than this photograph in 1979, an overhead conveyor was directly connected to the crushing plant to facilitate loading. The quarry started operating at Tidenham in about 1968 and now is the site of the diving centre. Now on the right hand side you see Tintern quarry. That has an automated loading system, and there are wagons underneath ready to be loaded directly from above. Tintern quarry closed much earlier in 1981. But the end of the line was becoming nearer. And on the 30th of August 1958, at least as far as passengers were concerned, concern was rising. There was a report into the Western Mail. Only one ticket sold during a day at Monmouth railway station recently, and that was a 6.5p one. And it was buses, not cars, that resulted in the fall-off of passenger traffic. They could run a regular service and pick up where passengers wanted to be picked up, rather than, for example, at Tintern, a mile from the town. Now, on the left, we see at Tintern the last train. Rail services finished on the same day as in the Monmouth Ross Railway. That was the 4th of January 1959. And the losses on the Wye Valley Railway that year were some £23,000 a year, quite a considerable sum. But when the line closed for passenger traffic in 1959, Tintern and Redbrook remained open for parcels and goods traffic. Both those stations closed in 1964, when the line closed completely except for quarry traffic. And we can see on the right-hand side a picture taken on the same day as the last train went through Tintern, And we know the names of the boys in the picture. They're Brian and Michael Jones, going left to right, Donald and Herbie Thomas, and Tony and Paul Hayward. And there's one not there who would ordinarily be in that group. It's Sheila Hayward Black's brother, Ken. He's not there under the signal post. He is in the cab. Now, you could hardly imagine that boys being allowed to stand so close to the line these days, could you? Let alone ride in the cab. But that happened regularly. We don't have a picture of Ken riding in a pad in the cab, but we do have a picture of Jim Simpson's brother John riding on the footplate at Tintern Station. Now, in summary, we have seen that the railway brought prosperity, but prosperity was not brought to everybody. Some people lost their jobs because of it, and the railway, in some ways, was over-ambitious, but it lasted for more than 100 years. Overall, the railway was a benefit, but one group of people were certainly not beneficiaries, and they were the ordinary shareholders, who put their money into building the railway, and but for them there would have been no railway. They lost almost everything. That is the end of the presentation.